Have no fear, little flock, for the Father delights in giving you the kingdom. This morning, our lessons invite us to reflect on the difference between fear and faith and how the life of faith teaches us to view our possessions. In the first lesson, Abraham and Sarah are still childless. God had promised a son, and now they are old, and the prospect of a child has now become impossible. Abraham laments that God has chosen to give him an abundance of land, livestock, and yet no heir to whom to bequeath all that wealth. You see, in the ancient times, there was no other reason to accumulate wealth than to be able to pass it on to sons. The promise of God's provision and protection is all well and good, Abraham says, but what about the big picture? As we've seen, Abraham is always the brash one when it comes to talking to God. So Abraham just puts it out there. What will you give me? I don't want any more land. I don't want any more cattle, no more sheep or goats. I want a son. God responds, but not as particularly as Abraham might have hoped. Perhaps he was hoping that God would now give him a heavenly birth announcement, or at least the news that Sarah was pregnant. But that's not what God says. God responds with a promise and an invitation. Abraham is invited into the impossible task of counting the stars and then to imagine that number of children. More to the point, God invites Abraham to imagine what the future will look like if God keeps God's promises. Trust me, God says. Abraham does. Abraham believes. Abraham has faith. Which brings us to the second lesson, one of the great faith chapters in the entire Bible. For 10 chapters, the writer to the Hebrews has been making the case that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the faith and the promises of ancient Israel. He makes that case to a small and persecuted and troubled and discouraged little church. And now in chapters 11 and 12, the writer sets up this hall of fame of all those who have come before and who have trusted, have believed that God is faithful, and have had faith. And the writer to the Hebrews counts all of these people and says that they all looked to the promises of God even though they didn't have them in their hands. They still believed that God was faithful and that God would keep God's promises. You actually should go home and read Hebrews 11 and 12 this afternoon. It's pretty remarkable. But before he gets to this Hall of Fame list, the writer takes a crack at defining faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of things not seen. Faith, he says, gives substance to what we cannot see. Faith makes real in the present what God will deliver in the future. Faith and hope are related like the heads and tails side of a quarter. Faith is to believe that God is trustworthy, and hope is to grasp the certainty of what still lies in the future. Hope in the Christian faith is not wishful thinking. We often hope for things that may not come true. A young woman just married says, I hope I will have children. But she may not. A rising middle-aged executive says, I hope I will get that promotion. He may not. An aging woman says, I hope I will be able to age in my home, and she may not. Christian hope is not like that. Christian hope is the absolute certainty that what God has promised, God will deliver. Hope informs a faith that is a particular way of seeing. Faith is to see that Jesus is the only way to life with a capital L. The way of Jesus is the only way to become most fully who God intended me to be. Faith allows us to walk into an uncertain future with confidence and hope because we believe that God is trustworthy and God will keep God's promises. And we can trust God because God is first and foremost a giver. Have no fear, little flock, for the Father delights in giving you the kingdom. Do you know what makes God happiest? I bet you're tempted to say, well, when I keep God's will, or when I love God, or when I do the right things, or when we do good things, when we serve our neighbor. Now, no mistake about it, those are all good things. But the God we see in Jesus takes most delight in being the giver. James says God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. And here, Jesus says that God takes delight in giving us the very kingdom. Listen, we do not have to coax a frugal and grumpy God into being nice to us. God delights in giving us the kingdom. God's kingdom is a whole new set of affairs reflecting God's intentions for human flourishing. God wants that kingdom to take root in our lives, in the real and lived experiences of our lives. That's God's good pleasure. You see, throughout his ministry, Jesus portrays God as the divine giver of that which we need the most: love and grace, mercy, acceptance, and forgiveness. In fact, Jesus himself, in his very body, is that gift which brings us God's best gifts. In his life, ministry, death, and resurrection, Jesus gave us the love of God in spades. It's the love that overcomes and heals the sin and the evil and the brokenness of our hearts. The verb tense of give in this first sentence of today's gospel lesson points to an action that has been completed once and for all in the past and has its effect forever. In the death and resurrection of Jesus, God gave us the kingdom. And because of that, we need not fear. Listen, we need not fear. Fear is the opposite of faith. Do you remember last week when we baptized little Emily Claire? Together we spoke with her and for her those baptismal renunciations. Do you remember those? Do you renounce the devil and all the forces that defy God? And we spoke exuberantly, I renounce them. Do you renounce the ways of sin that draw you from God? I renounce them. Do you renounce all the forces of evil that defy God? I renounce them, we said. Well, listen. Fear is one of the ways that that evil takes hold in our lives. Fear is to believe that our neighbor who is different from us is a threat and not the object of our love. Fear is to believe the only way I get what's mine is that someone else doesn't get what's theirs. Fear gives voice to the forces that defy God. Fear is to authorize and give permission to the powers of this world that rebel against God. Fear is to give a foothold in your life to the sin that draws you away from God. These are important words that Jesus says. Have no fear, little flock, for the Father delights in giving you the kingdom.